The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. This is Father Nathan Castle, your host. I'm in a hotel today. I'm traveling and meeting some people that are helping advance the mission of the work that my prayer partners and I do. But I'm taking the opportunity to be with you today to start a next trilogy in our series. And this one I think you're going to enjoy very much. I know I have been enjoying being part of it. This is a story that's not in any of the three books. It'll be, I think, the second time that we've gotten someone's permission to use their story to go directly to this podcast. Maybe these find their way into a fourth book in the Afterlife Interrupted series. But for now, we're telling new stories that are not available in print. So for those of you that have read all of those books and have enjoyed them, here's a new story for you. This one is called Luz, L-U-Z, Pete and Angel's John Paul or Paul John. This story we dealt with back in August of 2022, and it was via a Zoom call with Dave, my friend who is a retired dentist in Western New York, and Karen, who is a marriage and family therapist, or I'm never exactly sure how to get her title right. I should cement that. But anyway, she's a counselor in Southern California. We get together on Zoom calls regularly, and I asked them both if they would look back over their files of different stories that they had been a part of and pray about it and suggest to me any that they thought would make a good podcast. I'm particularly interested in stories that you might find helpful. You might apply some lesson in your own life that somehow telling their story might put before you. So this one was a vehicle accident. That's the category of sudden violent deaths that is the most common in the work that we do together. We get a lot of deaths by vehicular accidents. This one involved Luz, who told us that she was a young woman, but all of her life she had suffered with manic depression or bipolar illness. I think those are interchangeable. She was describing that her life had a constant noise in her head. She was diagnosed and on appropriate drugs, but she said the drugs, it felt like you were taking a drug to make yourself sad. Part of manic depressive circumstances is mania, which feels good. It feels hyper energetic and exciting and so on. Of course, it's part of a mental illness, so that brings with it lots of trouble. But she said, she needed the drug to even out her mood swings, but that still it was a chore to take a drug that she felt sometimes made you feel sad. I remember having a friend years ago that told me the same thing, that going off your meds was a thrill. Of course, it had all kind of negative consequences if you did, but that it was a temptation to just not take them. Well, Luz had an evening at home where she was not taking her meds and where she went into the manic phase. So she was hyper energetic, inside and out, kinetically in her body and in her thinking. And she said, I just decided to make my activity match my mood and my cognition. So she said, I couldn't sit still at home, so I just got the car keys and got in the car. And then once she did, she roared down the roadways as a maniac, as a person in mania. And she said she had no regard for anybody else on the road. She was just driving like she felt inside. Well, she caused an accident. The accident killed her and the driver of another car. The other driver was alone in his car. And what they had showed me in the initial dream, I felt at the time that I might be getting a blend of two people's stories, and in fact, that's what happened. Normally, a car crash that involves other people is narrated by the person we're helping to cross, and that's that. We don't have anything to do with the other people. It's just this one individual. But even as I received this dream, it had the affect that suggested, I wonder if two people who died in this accident are somehow uh, staying together or linked by what happened to them. And that's the way this played out. In the permission story, we only did that. I'm recording this in late February of 2025, and it was only about 3 weeks ago that we did the session where we went back into protected prayer and asked if we could speak to Luz and Pete. And it was really delightful when we did. We're not with these people. We've never met them in life. We meet them in this spirit form, and we meet them with a job to do. We are analogous to healthcare providers on a healing level of afterlife that appears to be there because people need it. People that die suddenly and violently are not ready for the joys of heaven or whatever you think uh, comes later, or even judgment or any of those things. What they need immediately is healthcare. That might seem strange to you that you outside of a body you would still need healthcare, but you still have your mentality. And if you've just been through a violent event, it makes sense to me that after all these years I've been doing this work, people need different kinds of afterlife care, and it's provided for them. We pretty much stay in our spot, which is near the door of this place, of this system, helping people who are now healthy enough to move from it to get out the door and be welcomed and escorted by someone. I think those of you who followed this podcast or read the books know that already. Nevertheless, in this story, we were right that uh, these two people who died in the same traffic accident, who were strangers to one another, got acquainted in the afterlife because this accident connected them. It turns out that Pete was an extraordinarily composed human person. The fact that he had just died in a car accident caused by another driver who was driving recklessly did not inspire him towards anger. In the dream, I watched him step out of the wreckage relatively whole. Of course, his body had died, but his spirit wasn't uh, dissipated or fragmented or overly affected by excited emotions. He had the capacity to simply take this event as one more in a series of events in a life and step out of the car, follow the escort of his guardian angel into his first phase of the afterlife, and did that as a pretty composed person. So that's extraordinary in itself. I think there's a lesson there that I take away. I'd like to be that guy. I would like to cultivate that peace of spirit that whatever befalls me, if it's truth, I just accept it as true and then I keep going. Well, as it turned out, the two of them, Luz driving one car and Pete driving the car that was hit by her car, they encountered one another in the spirit form after their deaths. Their guardians kept them together, and they gave me the image of a rope, but not a rope made out of hemp uh, or whatever other natural material ropes are made out of. It was a synthetic rope. I've seen many of them. And it was woven together, but they were two different colors. One of them was like a purplish and the other one was a yellow. They're clearly different strands, but they're going back and forth across one another the way ropes do. So they were showing me a graphic of these two lives that were separate, but who were choosing to be intertwined. As it turned out, their guardians did the same thing. And the guardians in this story are just wonderful. The guardians went by the names John and Paul, And when they first presented in the permission story, they said you not too long ago had successive popes, John Paul I and John Paul II, who both chose to take two men's names, two saint names, and fuse them into one. So we're using that as an example of ourselves. They said we are distinct angelic persons, but we don't have to stay separate if we choose not to. We can choose to be infused with each other, and our way of infusing in each other is even more interpenetrating than the image of separate strands woven together in a rope would suggest. They went on to talk about human interpenetration, including sexual loving, where the two become one, especially in the Christian notion of matrimony that's built into the vows. The two become one. He said, and we have this capacity because it exists first in the Godhead. As a Catholic Christian person, I was taught in kindergarten and first grade and at home that God is one, that there's one God, but that within the nature of God are three divine persons. And I was taught early to make the sign of the cross, the Trinitarian, the triune form of God, God being Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons in one God. So that's not an unfamiliar idea. I've had that all my life, that God is one in many. And I believe that that's really my nature too, and the nature of human persons is yes, we're individuals, but don't exaggerate that because we don't exist, no man is an island. We interpenetrate one another naturally. We breathe the same air. Um, we rely on all the same resources around us to sustain us. We normally create bonds with other people within families and friendship networks where we do uh, flow in and out of one another to varying degrees depending upon the kind of relationship we're in. So the idea that two can become one is also familiar to me because that's what love does. And I'm a loved person, and I believe I try to be a loving person, and that always involves some sort of movement in and out of one another or bonding. We very often use language that suggests that. When we talk about love, we'll say, "You're in my heart." Well, we use a lot of uh, linguistic forms like that to talk about being one. So, anyway, John and Paul are separate guardians, one guarding Luz and one guarding Pete. But they talked quite a lot in this story. And it's funny, they even talked about using their names interchangeably, that they could be called John Paul or Paul John. And they gave the example of top billing in a movie, that sometimes the one who is the most important has their name in big print and their name goes first, and the supporting actor is in smaller print and goes second. He said, we're interchanging our names so that you understand that we're co-equal. One's not more important than the other, and you can call us either one of those, John Paul or Paul John. So uh, it turned out that Luz and Pete were aware of each other almost instantly after their accident, which is uncommon. Again, my partners and I deal with lots of vehicular deaths, and very often the movement out of the body doesn't take them near other people that died in the accident. I wondered about that, as I was getting started in all this work 30 years ago, however long it's been. When people die in the same event, do they take the same transportation to the next place? Do they stay together? And what I found is it really depends, that people have some sort of volition, and so do their guardians, and that there's not one like rule uh, that always applies. Anyway, it turns out that Luz and Pete got to know each other, and he was informed about her circumstance, that he was told the woman who caused the accident um, suffered from a mental illness that impaired her good judgment, Unfortunately, you were the one she ran into, but she has no malice in her. Her ability to choose freely was impaired by her body chemistry and whatever else is going on that causes that um, bipolarity or manic depressive illness. So when he heard that, he was quick to understand and say, oh, well, then of course, I don't want to hold her responsible for something that wasn't entirely her fault. And he had compassion. I don't know how he would put it. I think he just made a decision. Oh, once he understood that, he thought, well, we're already together. Maybe we can do whatever it is we need to do next together. So the two of them kind of looked at one another in the afterlife. She said, I'm so grateful that the person whom I ran into and killed was Pete because he's wonderful and he's very understanding. He's very calm. He's good company. He's pleasant to be around. And we decided, well, we met this way, but we've already come this far together. Why don't we just stay together at least for a while and see how things unfold? I think it was Pete who told us, well, people got used to seeing us together in the afterlife and they began to think of us as a couple, Luz and Pete. But he said we weren't joined at the hip. We did many things together that were for our good, that were for our progress, but we were also free to go our separate ways and do independent activities, then come back to one another and continue healing as a team. I think it was Pete, could have been either one of them, who said, as we were progressing along a continuum of getting healthier and healthier, we were on the receiving end of other people's good deeds, other people's healing work. But they also said, you're far enough along that you could begin to turn around and help people who are not quite as healed as you are. And so they they said there were times when the two of them would be introduced to people who had also died in a violent way, perhaps, and uh, whom they could help. I've seen that a lot in afterlife work, and I've certainly seen it in this earthly realm. But we don't have to be whole, healed people to heal each other. There are a great many times when somebody can help, even though they don't look particularly competent. I'm thinking of how I'm staying in a hotel, and there's a parking lot right out there. I've seen families unload a car, and the 3-year-old is given a pillow. Here, carry this up to the room. Well, that's common enough, isn't it? You don't have to be have some sort of superpowers to do something that is helpful, and helping is a good thing. So that's a characteristic of this particular story. Uh, the two angels said, "We've enjoyed very much flowing into each other in a way that's helpful to and loving, and helpful to the ones whom we guard." Um, there ended up I had not mentioned the person who helped them originally when they did their crossing was a policeman, and his name is Officer Higley. He described himself as a peace officer. It's one of the phrases that we can use for law enforcement personnel. He said, very often our days are spent keeping the peace, but if we show up in the news, it's usually because there was a violent event. We had to do something to keep someone safe from someone else's violent behavior. He said, well, here, if on this plane, there's sort of a sorting process that happens. And if a person is still ill disposed towards others and willing to treat them in a way that's selfish or harmful, they're sorted out and they're escorted to the place where other people behave that way. Isn't that interesting? It didn't say thrown into a fiery pit for all eternity, but if you want to behave badly, there that can be accommodated. You can't stay here and do that, but there's another place that we can take you if you're insistent that that's what you want to do. And so it's freedom, and it doesn't have to do with any kind of deity pointing a finger and throwing anybody into fire. It's just if you are insistent that you want to behave that way, at least at present, you must not be here to do that. We'll take you where you can behave that way. It reminds me of giving a child a timeout. If you want to stay with that tantrum that you're in, you can't do that here in at the dinner table. You have to do that in your bedroom. So you're excused from the table, go to your room, and don't come back out here until you're smiling. Um, were you ever disciplined that way or observe that? It's not cruel. It's really not punitive. It's just saying that we have standards here, and our standards include uh, creating loving space for all of us to live in. And if you're going to behave badly, you're welcome to do that elsewhere, but not here. So Officer Higley explained that, and I just thought that's just lovely. Uh, and and people can get tired of selfish behavior, angry tirades, or desire for retribution or whatever. Uh, Sometimes that can be like a thunderstorm that plays itself out, and then there's a peace after the storm, a calm. We didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but he said, I don't have much to do anymore about protecting people because they don't really need protecting. Right now, I can do things like help an old woman across the street, something like that. He talked about police work as just serving uh, and making things more peaceful. And he said, now as a peace officer here, the work isn't very difficult at all. He just does simple things. In fact, he said, you don't even we because it was a permission asking session, we asked him if he would give his permission. And he said, "Well, my part in it was so small to begin with. It's kind of you to ask, but I don't really feel like uh, you need my permission." And he said, "Besides, it would be kind of selfish of me. These people, Luz and Pete, are so kind, given what happened to them, that it would just be bad of me to get in the middle and gum up the works. Go ahead, use the story and include me if you want to." So that's really the gist of it. Of course, this is the first of a part of a three-part story, a trilogy. So I just wanted you to get acquainted with this really remarkable story of two people who met in a car crash and who now are behaving as something of a team, Luz and Pete, and their guardians, John Paul or Paul John. Well, I'm grateful that you've spent this time with me on this podcast. The next one in this series will be part two of this trilogy. It'll be this same story of Luz, Pete, Paul, and John, um, but it will be focused on compassionate response to their story. Compassion means to suffer with or alongside. Um, and I think Pete was extraordinarily compassionate towards Luz. Uh, so we'll go into that in the next one, a compassionate response. And then the trilogy, the third part of the trilogy is always spiritual practice. So we'll look at some spiritual practice that might make us better people or happier or more peaceful people based on something that we heard in this story. That's it for now, then. Again, I'm Father Nathan Castle. I'm grateful that you joined me on this episode of The Joyful Friar. If you would like to be in touch and you're interested in this work that we do, but have not read any of the books that we put out there, I ask that you please do that first before asking me any questions about it. They're available on Amazon. They're not expensive. I was on there this morning, and I think the ebook version of them is going for under $10. There's audiobook versions and paperback uh, book versions, all of which are easily available on Amazon. But I do enjoy hearing from you. So if you have a question or a comment that pertains to this story, you can contact me through my website, which is nathan-castle.com. Just go to the contact button or however you do that on there and be in touch with me by email. And if you do that, I appreciate it if you let me know what time zone you live in. If you leave a phone number, sometimes I just contact by text, or if we want, we arrange a phone call. But anyway, I'm grateful for your interest. Remember that I'm praying for you. When I do, I pray for uh, wherever there is the deepest need in you for healing of anything, and that this Holy Spirit would go to that place and bring light, happiness, and peace. And that's the way I pray for you. So, anyway, that's it. Thanks for being with me on this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. God bless you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.